This is a story of missed opportunities and how the best-prepared law enforcement agencies failed to catch the bloodiest mafia killer, Roy DeMeo. To murder, Roy was what Henry Ford was to the automotive industry. He designed it, organized it, and killed with efficiency. In the 1970s, DeMeo embarked on a wild spree of murders. When Roy killed you, your body would never be found. His victims could be as many as 200 people. He was as guilty as any serial killer. Not only did he kill his victims, but he also dismembered them, degraded them, and stripped them of their humanity forever. Some were killed simply for being with a target. If you look up evil in the dictionary, his picture would appear. The big question is why the police and the FBI did not stop Roy DeMeo sooner. In 1975, detectives working for the Organized Crime Task Force made a macabre discovery. It was a quiet Sunday in Queens, in an alley behind the market. Behind the meat pantry, the police discovered the remains of a young adult stuffed into several garbage bags. The victim was Andrey Katz, a small-time criminal and very skilled car thief. He supplied cars to body shops and used car dealerships. He came from what was then a dangerous area of the city, the Canarsie district of Brooklyn. During the 1970s, Canarsie was the epicenter of the city's stolen car trafficking. The area was famous for its body shops, mechanic shops, and auto graveyards. Many of these mechanic shops were known as chop shops, specializing in dismantling stolen cars to use their parts. However, when Katz's body was discovered, it was evident that someone had been dismantling more than just cars. No one realized that this macabre discovery was the first clue in one of the most shocking crime sprees ever remembered. Initiated by one of the bloodiest mafia killers, Roy DeMeo. Roy's life could have been very different. His mother wanted him to be a doctor. One of his uncles was a prominent prosecutor, another a forensic scientist. But Roy DeMeo never envisioned such a promising future. After starting as an errand boy and part-time butcher, he chose a life of crime in the late 1960s. Roy DeMeo was doing well in his chosen career. He was a successful thug and street gangster. But DeMeo wanted more. He longed to become a so-called made man, a full-fledged member of a mafia crime family, and soon he got what he always wanted. One day he received a call. Someone wanted to meet with him. The call came from this house, the home of Nino Gaggi, a mafia captain in the infamous Gambino crime family of New York. He was introduced into the organization by Nino Gaggi, who worked for Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino family. The Gambinos were the most powerful of the New York crime families. The 5 crime families controlled New York's underworld. For DeMeo, a meeting with Nino Gaggi was an honor and could be the first step toward becoming a member of the Mafia. Gaggi placed DeMeo on the first rung of the Mafia ladder. He became an associate, working with Nino on various schemes to increase their respective fortunes. DeMeo's business interests, loan sharking, gambling, theft, fit perfectly. The honeymoon period started well as DeMeo expanded his loan sharking business. Soon Roy was doing what any mafia boss dreams of, making money hand over fist. But DeMeo was more than just a loan shark, he was an entrepreneur. He began to set his sights on other areas of crime such as pornography. At that time, hardcore pornography was illegal, and some crime family bosses, including the Gambinos, frowned upon it. However, DeMeo saw it as too good an opportunity to pass up. Nino Gaggi turned a blind eye for one simple reason: the profits were tremendous. To fulfill his agreements, DeMeo built his own specialized gang known as the DeMeo Crew. Each member had their own area of expertise. It included Chris, whose real name was Rosenberg, a ruthless 24-year-old with a penchant for fast cars and drugs. Chris was the gang's getaway driver. Freddie was a race car driver highly respected as a car thief who could escape any police chase. Other members of the crew included Young and Anthony Center, who were so close they were nicknamed the Gemini twins. Together, they were a curious mix of characters, but they were united by their admiration for DeMeo. They saw him as a father figure, and as he rose in the ranks, he brought them up with him. Roy was like a father to them, their mentor and their boss. The gang often met at a bar on Flatlands Avenue in Brooklyn. Today it's a church, but back then it was called the Gemini Lounge and served as the DeMeo Crew's club and base of operations. The Gemini Lounge was a neighborhood bar. It wasn't a nightclub. It was a very quiet place where men coming home from work could go for a drink. The only exception was that its owner was Roy DeMeo. From his base at the Gemini Lounge, DeMeo began to expand his criminal operation. Roy was an entrepreneur who sought many ways to grow his business, and he did so exceptionally well. In 1972, he achieved an extraordinary feat for a career criminal. He entered the world of finance and was elected to the board of directors of a small bank, the Brooklyn Credit Union. Initially, Roy started working under Nino Gaggi, helping to launder money. But DeMeo didn't stop there. He saw the opportunity to steal cash as well as launder it. What happened next was that Roy immersed himself in the business, organized it, and took it a step further. DeMeo began embezzling money, looting the bank's capital, and even got other directors to do the same. By the time he was done, the bank had gone bankrupt, having provided him and his associates with substantial funds. Nino Gaggi and DeMeo pocketed hundreds of thousands of dollars. The bankruptcy of even a small bank could have spelled disaster for DeMeo as the FBI and tax authorities began investigating the credit union collapse. However, both Gaggi and DeMeo had already distanced themselves from that activity, and they couldn't be implicated. As a result, they were free and clear. DeMeo had managed to elude the authorities and now believed he could get away with anything, even murder. In 1973, Roy DeMeo was 32 years old. His pornography business was doing well, but DeMeo thought it could do better. Then one of his associates, Paul Rosenberg, was arrested. Under pressure, DeMeo feared that Rosenberg might reveal his role in the industry, so he decided to take action. In July 1973, DeMeo coldly picked up Rosenberg and drove him to a quiet part of the city. It was his first murder. The execution changed him. He discovered that killing gave him a sense of power. Now, he wouldn't hesitate to kill again whenever an obstacle arose. Soon, the opportunity for more murders presented itself due to DeMeo's growing interest in another lucrative business, car theft. The DeMeo Crew was gaining prominence in the profitable stolen car trafficking industry. They had a well-organized gang of between 17 and 20 car thieves operating every night in New York. Enormous amounts of money could be made, as a car was often worth more for its parts than as a functioning vehicle. Everyone had their orders and knew their roles. The crew stole cars and either assigned them new documentation or dismantled them in the chop shops of Canarsie. They didn't just steal any car, they knew exactly what kind of cars they needed to steal. Some customers wanted a Jaguar, others a Cadillac or a Porsche. They stole on demand the exact car, model, year. Any luxury car would eventually need replacement parts, making this a highly profitable operation. So what they started doing was dismantling the cars and selling the parts, a very lucrative business. It was at the height of this activity that the local car thief and DeMeo associate, Andrey Katz, got into trouble with the police. Andrey was arrested on a drug charge, and they feared what he might reveal to the authorities. Worried that Katz might talk, DeMeo consulted his mentor, Nino Gaggi. After a meeting with Roy and his capo, Nino Gaggi, the order was given to kill Andrey. DeMeo devised an elaborate plan. Katz was lured by a female accomplice into a trap where they captured him, put a noose around his neck, and dragged him into a car. Then, DeMeo and his crew took Katz to a meat pantry behind the meat market in Queens. But this time, DeMeo did something different. Inspired by the surroundings, he used his butchering skills. That's how Andrey Katz ended up in pieces inside several garbage bags. The next thing you see in the headlines is the news of a dismembered body, found in the back by a vagrant who thought he had stumbled upon a leg of lamb. In reality, it was Andrey's thigh, identified by a tattoo on it. They wrapped it in butcher paper and carefully placed it in the garbage bins behind Pantry Pride. However, DeMeo made a mistake. The body parts were found because the trash wasn't collected over the weekend. Once again, DeMeo got away with it. The 1975 police investigation into Katz's murder failed to uncover the gang's involvement. No witnesses came forward to testify, and no incriminating evidence was found. According to retired homicide detective Joe Ling, the reason was that Katz wasn't the right type of victim. If the victim is a store owner, there is more social impact. But when the victim is a figure in organized crime, there isn't as much outcry, and detectives don't show as much interest. Ling considered this a significant weakness. He would often go to see his boss, and sometimes had to practically beg on his knees for permission to investigate the homicide. From then on, Roy DeMeo began to enjoy this form of murder. He was probably one of the most vile, ruthless, and bloodthirsty characters I have ever encountered. Dismemberment was rarely used by the Mafia, but for DeMeo, it had become his signature. He had no respect for human life, no respect for anyone but himself. If you look up evil in the dictionary, his photo will appear. DeMeo discovered that anyone could be made to disappear. They would cut the body into pieces, carefully wrap the parts, and leave them in dumpsters. The dumpsters would be emptied and the contents taken to the vast Fountain Avenue landfill in Brooklyn. All the garbage from Brooklyn and Queens was taken there. In that landfill, there was a special area for their meat products, which had to be immediately covered with garbage, and bulldozers would cover everything. If something was thrown there, it would never be found. That's why they used it. More and more people were disappearing. There was a number of individuals who had vanished, and we could never locate them. There was a group of men who were killing people whose bodies were never found. Restricted area. Proper identification is required. Today, the landfill has long been turned into a landscaped area, and there are few clues about the number of bodies DeMeo sent there. In addition to using the landfill, the crew also disposed of their victims in another way. They would dismember the bodies, pack them in sturdy bags, and toss them from a boat into the ocean. DeMeo became increasingly adept at his work. He was so skilled that even the boss of the family, Paul Castellano, called upon him to use his services as a hitman, hazardous waste. He had found out that his son-in-law was cheating on his daughter. One of the bodies belonged to Paul Castellano's son-in-law, ordered DeMeo to kill him. Once again, the body was never found. Surprisingly, despite all the disappearances, the police department failed to establish a pattern, except for one person, Detective Joe Wendland. Initially, a colleague from the Stolen Vehicle Task Force, John, noticed something. All the murders are linked to the world of stolen vehicle trafficking, an informant told me. Look at the number of car thieves who are disappearing. I think they're being chopped up, and that's why we can't find them. Despite that lead, no one continued investigating. Few shared Wendland's enthusiasm for delving deeper. The 20th Precinct Police Department was indeed in crisis. Poor financial management led to a halt in police recruitment. Morale was low, and public confidence in the police department had plummeted to all-time lows. The Stolen Vehicle Task Force was overwhelmed, and the FBI showed no interest in local car thefts, so it was fantastic times for DeMeo, with nothing standing in his way. The business thrived. In 1974 alone, 77,000 cars were stolen in New York City. No area was safe from car theft. It affected the entire country, though major metropolitan areas experienced the fastest growth rates. For DeMeo, money kept pouring in abundantly. It was a terrible epidemic of car theft-related crimes, and a huge number of warehouses filled with car shells were discovered. However, DeMeo wasn't entirely at ease. Another law enforcement unit was investigating his crew's meetings at the Gemini Lounge. It was a separate unit, the Organized Crime Intervention Group of the Queens District Attorney's Office, and Detective Kenny was the intelligence agent. He kept all the files on organized crime, covering every funeral, every wedding, writing small notes, and maintaining folders upon folders on all the families. So, Joling, John Murphy, and Kenny McCabe did what the broad array of law enforcement agencies hadn't been able to do. They started comparing notes, convinced that DeMeo was involved in murders. They began surveillance tasks, but could only do so in their spare time. They had missed the fact that DeMeo had just received a significant promotion. In 1977, Roy DeMeo achieved what he had always desired. He became a full-fledged Mafia member and was formally initiated into the criminal Mafia family. To be initiated, you either become a money earner or a hitman. You either kill someone or make money. DeMeo was both. He became what was called a made man, working full-time for Capo Nino Gaggi. It was a momentous occasion in DeMeo's life and the fulfillment of a dream. So, DeMeo and his crew were ecstatic, and with the euphoria came more murders. Things were going so well for the crew. He even took on jobs for any client who paid for it. contract killings in what became known as the murder machine. Roy decided to expand the business to include not only the assassination of enemies, but also killings for the families. They accepted any contract, inviting the victim to a party and never seeing them again. That's what Roy did. 1979 was a peak for DeMeo's murder machine. To meet the demand, the crew carried out the killings and dismemberments indoors. Most of the murders were now committed in the back of the Gemini Lounge. Behind the lounge was an apartment rented by a guy named Khan. They lured the victim there with a ruse and brought them into the apartment. DeMeo would shoot the victim in the head, quickly wrapping them in a towel. Chris Rosenberg would then stab the victim in the heart to stop the bleeding. The body was then left to drain for 45 minutes in the bathroom before being placed in the bathtub, dismembered, and packed into a sturdy garbage bag. After dismembering the body and flushing the blood down the bathtub drain, they would all sit down with DeMeo, order a pizza, and eat it with their hands covered in blood. That's how despicable these people were. Over time, the dismemberment process turned into a sadistic ritual. There was no need for it. It was pure evil. The Mafia doesn't carry out their killings like that to such extremes. When they can, they simply put a bullet in the victim's head and dump their body in the river. They did it out of pure perversion, and DeMeo employed these methods because he was a psychopath. Despite having killed nearly 100 people, DeMeo could now make bigger deals. So he embarked on an ambitious plan to export stolen cars to Cuba. He had become an international criminal. Needless to say, during the interval he made several people disappear, but the plan brought hefty profits to both Nino and him. In a short amount of time, they were receiving orders for 5,000 vehicles per week through their contact in Kuwait. Meanwhile, DeMeo became increasingly involved in cocaine dealings. Paul Castellano frowned upon drug trafficking as it attracted law enforcement attention. However, primarily through crew member Chris Rosenberg, cocaine businesses flourished. In early 1979, Rosenberg traveled to Florida to purchase cocaine from a group of Cubans. Upon landing in Florida, Rosenberg struck a deal to acquire a kilo of cocaine to be delivered to New York. However, upon his return to New York, Rosenberg made a grave mistake that would have serious consequences for DeMeo. The Cubans came to deliver the drugs, expecting payment. When Rosenberg refused to pay and threatened to kill them, he murdered 3 people. The Cuban bosses were outraged by Rosenberg's actions. When DeMeo found out, he said, "They're going to send an army here and they're going to kill you." And he asked, "What name did you give them?" Rosenberg replied, "I said I was acting on behalf of Roy DeMeo." Then Roy said, "My God, my family is dead. They're going to come here and wipe out my whole family." Rosenberg's murders could lead to an all-out war between the Cubans and the Gambino clan. In compensation, the Cubans demanded someone's head, leading to what would later be known as the Cuban Crisis. So, DeMeo decided to offer a sacrifice, his friend Chris Rosenberg. He decided that Chris had to disappear. They stabbed and shot him. They had to make sure the Cubans knew they had fulfilled their part of the deal. DeMeo couldn't make the body disappear. He needed a scene. They couldn't dismember Chris. They had to leave his body visible for the headlines. They parked his car in Floyd Park, leaving him seated inside with a 9mm gun between his legs. Then they riddled the car with bullets. It made headlines once Rosenberg was gone, and DeMeo returned to his business, still enjoying the favor of Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino family, who valued his special skills. DeMeo couldn't be killed because Paul needed his hitmen, and his men were highly respected, granting Paul even more power. Nobody would dare to cross Paul, which made DeMeo crucial to Paul Castellano. However, the Cuban crisis left its mark on DeMeo. The idea that the Cubans wanted to kill him made him paranoid, leading him to commit a grave mistake. He mistook an 18-year-old vacuum cleaner salesman for a Cuban assassin. Roy became very nervous when he saw that poor Electrolux salesman wandering around the houses of Mazapiquaro and going up to his house to sell a vacuum cleaner. They pursued the poor guy through the streets of Long Island, killed him, and made him disappear. Although the murder was committed in broad daylight, the police obtained no information. No witness dared to speak, But this time, the boss of the Gambino family, Paul Castellano, began to grow concerned about the attention Roy DeMeo was attracting to himself. So by late 1979, Castellano decided to kill two members of his criminal family. He instructed Nino Gaggi and Roy DeMeo to carry out the murders. The order came to Nino Gaggi: kill them, take care of it personally. So Nino decided to enlist his right-hand man and primary hitman, Roy. They arranged a meeting with the father and his son. They had them in the car, but the father realized it wasn't going to end well. An off-duty local police officer witnessed the murders and pursued them. A police sergeant who worked part-time as a taxi driver saw the gunfire, picked up on it, and a massive shootout ensued. Nino was hit, and Roy escaped. The fact that there had been a murder and shootout involving a police officer was something that couldn't be ignored. Finally, investigators began to establish the connection between DeMeo and his crew, linking them to the stolen vehicle trafficking and the murders in the Canarsie district, as well as between Nino and the Mafia boss, Paul Castellano. Then, in 1980, the FBI made a key discovery. A customs official on duty at the docks noticed a shipment of cars destined for Kuwait. They appeared to be stolen vehicles with new registration documents. The investigation quickly led to a warehouse, which the FBI raided, finding it full of stolen cars ready to be exported by DeMeo to Kuwait. A fingerprint found at the scene pointed to DeMeo's crew, clearly highlighting the scale of the case. Not only was a Mafia family selling stolen cars in Brooklyn, but they were also exporting them to another country, which was unprecedented. It suddenly became an international case, attracting widespread interest. In 1982, the pressure on DeMeo continued to mount as a new task force moved into the square in New York to handle the case. It was led by a highly respected prosecutor, Walter Mack. Walter was truly a brilliant prosecutor, one of the best I've ever known without a doubt. He was a man with courage, and he was the one who pieced the whole case together. He threw himself into the investigation wholeheartedly. Mack's job was to get all the agencies working together. A team of federal, state, local, and municipal investigators was formed. Soon, Joe Ling joined the team, and we spurred Walter's interest, asking him to promise that if he took on the case, he would see it through to the end. Walter Mack delivered on that promise, and soon it became clear that what had started as a case of large-scale vehicle trafficking was evolving into something much bigger. The police had initially handed us a case of stolen vehicle trafficking. Although there were expectations that the Mafia might emerge during the investigation, there were no signs initially that it was purely a Mafia-related case. As Mack and his team delved deeper into the investigation, DeMeo's killing machine came to light. Over the next 6 months to a year, the extraordinary combined efforts of motivated investigators unfolded. They were convinced that the members of DeMeo's crew had evaded accountability for truly horrific acts and were dedicated to finding the means and mechanisms to piece it all together. With steadfast determination, Mack and his team built the case against DeMeo and his boss, Nino Gaggi. This time, they were determined not to let them slip away. There was a commitment to the victims, the mothers, fathers, husbands, wives, brothers, and sisters, that justice was finally going to be served. And that drove them forward. One tactic they explored was to pressure DeMeo to see if he would crack. Then, they received information that could truly unsettle him, a decisive step. One day, the phone rang, and a new informant calling himself Harry claimed to know everything about the network of stolen vehicle trafficking. Harry was none other than a partner of DeMeo's crew. They brought him to Manhattan one Sunday night, where nobody was present except them and the prosecutor. They made him sit down and told him what they wanted, all the information about the chop shops and the homicides. Arena started to sing, and the agents were left speechless. They invited Arena and had him seated for a week and a half, where he gave a detailed account of each murder, how they were carried out, and how they dismembered the bodies. He said the easiest part to sever was the head. It split like a pencil. Arena left them astonished, divulging everything about Roy DeMeo. To further prove his credentials, the informant pointed the team to the whereabouts of one of the victims. His body was found exactly where Arena said it would be, inside a cement barrel at the bottom of a lake. They discovered the remains of what was once a human, now reduced to a skeleton. He was wearing work jacket and pants and had a wallet in the jacket pocket. In the wallet, there was a card with his dentist's name, which allowed us to identify him in about an hour. As a result, Joling was sent to the Gemini Lounge to present the situation to DeMeo and offer him a deal in exchange for cooperation. They knew Roy was involved in so many murders, so many deaths, that he would be a valuable source of information for the police. Roy DeMeo wasn't at all interested in the deal. Instead, Joling found that DeMeo offered him a deal. Roy said, "You'll have to kill me. You're two old dogs to go looking for trouble. I'll give you $1 million in a Swiss bank account in your wives' names. Give me the okay, and you can live like kings." I turned around and told him, "Someday I'll pull you out of the trunk of your car, but if you come with us, I'll save your life." And he replied, "I'm a good soldier. I'm in the Mafia, and when they call me, I'll come like a good soldier." But the case was progressing well, and with the accumulating evidence, it seemed only a matter of time before DeMeo would be prosecuted. Then a disaster struck that threatened to ruin everything. As the trial date approached, Roy DeMeo disappeared. Police went in search of DeMeo. Informants claimed to have seen him roaming the streets armed to the teeth like a madman. Then the police received a call. Roy DeMeo, the ruthless killer, had been found dead in the trunk of his Cadillac. I went to the scene. They lifted the trunk, and there he was, stiff as a board. I thought to myself, what a tribute to our work. They had murdered a guy who was making them a lot of money. His Cadillac was left parked in a lot behind the Baruna Yacht Club in Brooklyn. He died as he had lived, like a street rat, curled up in the fetal position in the trunk of a car. No law enforcement officer felt the slightest hint of compassion or empathy, including myself. The matter was clear. The responsibility for the team of investigators fell on the head of the Gambino family, Paul Castellano. He was the man with the most motives. DeMeo was killed because Paul Castellano deemed him a risk. They realized that we were getting close to DeMeo, and they thought that if we finally arrested him, incarcerated him, and turned him into an informant, it would have meant the destruction of their entire empire. Castellano had reasons to be worried, even in death. DeMeo had left too many incriminating pieces of evidence that would bring about the destruction of the family. Shortly after, law enforcement officers arrived at the Gemini Lounge with a search warrant. We dismantled the bathroom and found blood in the pipes. Contrary to what is seen on television, blood never disappears. If there is blood in the pipes or on the walls, it will remain there forever and will be identifiable. This allowed us to match the blood with samples from the victims and their perpetrators. The evidence led the team to DeMeo's boss and lieutenant of Paul Castellano, Nino Gaggi. The case became the state's trial against Gaggi, but Paul Castellano was not safe either. He also faced a trial. During a 2-week recess that the jury took in the Christmas of 1985, Castellano went to a restaurant accompanied by one of his loyal associates. Unknown gunmen ambushed him and shot him. It was a setup. They lured him there and executed him as he got out of the car. Castellano's death was the result of all our work and Walter's. We locked up all his killers, all his top soldiers, and that allowed them to kill Paul. With Castellano gone in one final trial, the rest of DeMeo's crew and their boss Nino Gaggi were tried for the remaining murders, including the one of the car thief, Andrey Katz. It wasn't a case built overnight or in a week. It was the result of years of investigation, conversations with informants, sending agents to Kuwait, and painstaking effort. In the end, Walter Mack's work resulted in the worst murderer ever to join the ranks of the Mafia, leaving behind not only a shattered criminal family, but also something more chilling. Only a fraction of his murders have been solved. The truth is, we'll never know the exact number. If he claimed to have killed 150 individuals, I'd say between 150 and 200 would be a rough estimate. I believe Roy was extremely efficient and ruthless in protecting his territory. There were people who called us, reporting the disappearance of their daughters, young girls hanging around bars and similar places, and we never heard from them again. As for delivering justice to the victims, it's a rather complex matter. Is it really possible? I'm one of those who think that the wounds of the victims' families never heal. DeMeo was as guilty as any serial killer. Not only did he kill his victims, but he also dismembered them, degraded them, and forever stripped them of their humanity. He was a perverse and cruel human being, if he can even be called human. I don't believe so. I would characterize it as such. By missing several crucial opportunities to stop DeMeo, the law enforcement machinery must bear its share of responsibility. While it's true that this same machinery ultimately made strenuous efforts to end the situation, a fundamental question remains unanswered. Could there have been earlier reactions and responses found for the families of his victims? As we close this chapter, reflecting on the chilling accounts of Roy DeMeo's reign of terror, one thing becomes abundantly clear. The pursuit of justice is relentless, even in the face of the most heinous crimes. While we may never fully comprehend the extent of DeMeo's atrocities or the true number of lives he extinguished, what we do know is that the tireless dedication of law enforcement and the unwavering resilience of victims' families serve as beacons of hope in the darkest of times. As we bid farewell to this series, let us carry forward the lessons learned, the stories shared, and the memories of those whose lives were forever altered by one man's insatiable thirst for power. May their stories inspire us to stand against injustice, to seek truth, and to ensure that the echoes of history never fade into silence. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until we meet again.